Good morning, everyone. My name is Deana Weibel. Thank you very much for inviting me here today to your community. I'm eager to talk about the work I've done and maybe some interesting overlaps with the perspectives you all hold. And so I'm very grateful for the invitation. So the talk I'm giving this morning is called The Ultraview Effect: Awe, Humility, and Exploring the Unknown. And hopefully Brad's computer will work the way I expect it to. Okay. So, as a cultural anthropologist, the work I'm doing currently in this research that has to do with space and spirituality and religion is in some ways what you might not expect from a cultural anthropologist. Traditionally, people would assume that we would live in a small village somewhere, studying perhaps an indigenous population. The truth is, if humans are involved, anthropologists can study it. And I wish there was a little village of astronauts that I could go live in and study, but such a thing, well, the International Space Station exists, but so far I have not figured out a way to get funding to go up there. But in this image here, there's some examples of places that I've done research. We've got the Vehicle Assembly Building in Florida. This is kind of tricky here. I'm gonna maybe hold this a little bit. The first picture there is in Florida, the Vehicle Assembly Building. I've done some research there. The second picture is interesting. I was in an experimental airplane created by a test pilot who worked for a company that built experimental spaceships. He made this airplane in his kitchen, and it had a little plate on it that said that it did not meet FAA guidelines. But when I suggested that perhaps I wasn't sure I wanted to fly in it, he said, well, the last person who I took up was a 90-year-old Holocaust survivor, and I was like, okay, fine. So that was really cool. So we were over Mojave. The third picture is actually the Mars Yard at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where they try out things that the Curiosity rover and other rovers will try out on Mars ahead of time with similar rovers. I was at the Specola Vaticana, which is the Vatican Observatory in Castel Gandolfo outside of Rome, which is where the Pope's astronomers live. They have a guest apartment. I was there for a full month, which was awesome. There's Space Fest in the bottom point there. That was in Tucson in 2019. And then because we do, as anthropologists, participant observation, I not just attended the NASA Human Research Program Investigators Workshop, but also gave a poster presentation. So we call it participant observation. And so I don't have a village I can live in. What it means is I have to travel to a lot of different places where people involved in the space community are, including astronauts. All right, so we're going to start out with the overview effect. The overview effect is not the title of my book. The title of my book is The Ultraview Effect, but it is a takeoff on the overview effect, which is a phenomenon first described by a researcher named Frank White. Frank White was very interested in the fact that when you are up in the air, like for instance in an airplane, you can see much more clearly what's happening below you. So one famous example he gave is two people are driving in cars, they're on other streets, they're heading toward the same intersection. They don't know about each other till they reach the intersection, but if you're in an airplane above them, you can see that happening. And he was interested in how having an overview gave you a much stronger understanding of what was happening on the ground. He began to theorize that astronauts would have an even greater overview effect, being able to see the Earth from space. He started in the 1980s interviewing astronauts and found out that this was in fact the case. And I was very interested when I started doing research into space and people's experiences in space in the overview effect. I'll give you a tiny bit of background. I did my doctoral dissertation research at a French shrine called Roquemadour in central France, which is a 1,000-year-old Black Madonna shrine built onto the side of a cliff. I was very interested in how people climbing the cliff for religious purposes or visiting the shrines, there are like 10 churches there that are all halfway up the cliff. In some cases, the actual buildings have 3 normal walls and the 4th wall is the cliff face. So if it rains, it's raining inside the building. There's water pouring down on that fourth wall. It's an amazing place. That experience of a sacred place that was so connected to the size and enormity of the cliff, that made people feel so small as they were participating in rituals, made me really curious about what astronauts experience. I came out to the Grand Rapids area in 2003. I was hired by Grand Valley, and very soon afterwards met my husband, Glenn Swanson, who's sitting there. And we partnered up for our first space article right ahead of our wedding in 2006, where we were blending his space history background and my anthropology of religion background to kind of understand how people experience things. So the overview effect, when I got tenure and didn't have to worry about doing weird research anymore, I could do what I wanted. I started interviewing astronauts more regularly. Glenn had introduced me to my first astronaut, and I use pseudonyms in my research, which is traditional for anthropologists. I call him Tom, the first astronaut that I interviewed, back in 2004. But starting in 2017, I began to interview more and more astronauts using what we in research call the snowball effect, where somebody introduces you to somebody else who introduces you to somebody else. And so it's not big numbers. I don't do quantitative research. It's qualitative research. It's in-depth. It's what those of you with anthropology backgrounds might have heard the term thick description. More interested in depth than breadth. But I also did a lot of research into the general space community. But the chance to talk to actual astronauts who'd been in space was amazing. So talking about the overview effect and what it was like to see the Earth from space. And for most of them that I interviewed, it was an amazing thing that changed their perspective on how fragile the planet was, how much we need to protect it, how borders are artificial, although in some cases, if you're traveling at night over Korea, you can see a very clear difference between North Korea and South Korea, just in terms of the lighting. But in general, there was a sense of understanding the Earth as an object that they hadn't understood quite so fully before. It brought reality to it. But I became interested after talking to several astronauts about what happens when you turn outward and look in another direction. So this was an image taken by a NASA astronaut recently named Matthew Dominic. He's one of the best photographers among the astronauts. This was taken over time with time-lapse photography, but some of the astronauts I've spoken to who've become dark adapted while in space have described similar sights that they could see with the naked eye, where the sheer number of stars are overwhelming. And the first astronaut that I spoke to is an astronaut about this phenomenon, is an astronaut I call Zach in my book. Now, Zach was an Apollo astronaut. Once again, it's tricky because I cannot divulge names, but there aren't that many Apollo astronauts. I will tell you that he did orbit the moon. And this, whoops, and I'm gonna drop things on the floor.
Are you done? I'll just
Put that on a more solid piece of equipment here. But when Zach was orbiting the moon, he had a chance to be in some of the most solitude that any human has ever experienced. By the way, the illustrations in the book are done by an artist friend of mine named Carl Tate. And so this is an example of one of Carl Tate's artworks. I described to him what I wanted. And there's like an interesting parallel here between the side of the moon and the idea of the cliff at Rocamadour and feeling very small. Anyway, Zach was in orbit. He went to the far side of the moon, where the moon itself was stopping radio communication from NASA. The other two fellows that he was traveling with were literally on the moon. And Zach described a situation where he turned off all the lights in the capsule. He waited 20, 25 minutes for his eyes to get adapted to the dark. So if you know when you go to bed at night, it's super dark in your bedroom, you wake up in the middle of the night, you can kind of see things. Having to wait for that to take place. And then he looked out the window. And I think I have a quote here on the next page. He says, "At some points in my orbit around the moon, I was in shadow from both Earth and the sun. So it was a complete darkness. And all of a sudden, the star patterns out there became something that I was not ready for. So many stars, I couldn't see one. It was just a sheet of light. And it really shook him. It changed him. He had been, I would say, more of a mainline Protestant. Being able to see so many stars he couldn't make out constellations brought home to him that those were all suns, and that many of them probably had planets. And even if the tiniest percentage of those that had planets had some form of life, and even if the tiniest percentage of those that had life had intelligent life, that was still literally billions and billions, to quote Carl Sagan, of places out there that we can sort of see but not contact, that could be teeming with life like ours. And it changed the way he understood his religious beliefs, his spirituality, everything. He was a little stressed out by the experience. When he came home, he stopped attending parties, because there are a lot of parties when you come home as an Apollo astronaut. And he began writing a lot of poetry to sort of make sense of what he had understood. So what kind of experience is this? This image is a recent image posted by an astronaut named Deana Weibel. He's retired now. He is on LinkedIn, which is where I stole this. But this is the one that he took from the International Space Station. Once again, an intense star field. What Zach experienced was an orbit around the moon in a double shadow. So very intense darkness. This is sort of a hint of that, but so far we haven't gotten any good pictures from that intense darkness that sort of replicates what the human eye can see. So what is the difference? What kind of experience is this looking out? The overview effect is looking at the Earth from space. The ultraview effect, and it took me a while to come up with the name. Ultra means beyond, and so eventually I was like, okay, ultraview, that seems to make sense, is looking out into the solar system. What people experience when they see the Earth from space is an increase generally in understanding. What they see looking out tends to be a complete destruction of any illusion of understanding. We can say, oh, there's the Earth. I see continents, I see weather. I understand that the atmosphere is thin. Looking out, it's like, I don't understand how there are that many stars. Wait, it's an overwhelming feeling. Theo is an astronaut, that's a pseudonym again, who has been out in space many, many times, and he loved to talk to me about this. Theo was a spiritual seeker. Theo was the only person who has described going into what he called Buddhist meditation in space by pushing away from the wall of the vehicle that he was in, spacecraft he was in, getting into a neutral position and meditating, he said, until he could no longer feel his limbs, until he could no longer become aware of his body, in total darkness, in orbit, somewhere around the Earth, in space. Kind of a sensory deprivation thing without the water. He loved to seek these experiences. And he said when he saw this wall of stars, it's a hard wall. It's a hard wall. The Milky Way is a hard white wall. It is unbelievably solid up there. He got frustrated because on a couple of his missions, the other astronauts were not willing to turn off the lights in the spacecraft to allow for dark adaptation. It wasn't until he was on a mission where he knew the commander, and the commander basically said, okay, we're gonna do this. Where he was on the darker side of the Earth, in the night side, right? So the Earth is always under sunlight, one side is on light and one is in darkness. They were on the dark side, which lasts about 45 minutes. And they call it a night pass. They were doing a night pass, turned off the lights finally, and he was allowed to see it. And he said, you're looking at galaxies with the naked eye. You're in the heavens. You're in a place that will increase your spirituality. And some of these guys, especially the pilots, are a little rough. He said, you'll do the checklist a hell of a lot better if you're on top of your spirituality than if you're not. It's the same as goddamn water or food. So for him, he thought NASA should be paying attention to astronaut spirituality, that NASA should be allowing them to have those experiences, and got frustrated that that wasn't always the case. Another astronaut that I call Charles couldn't get into a dark adapted state naturally, but there was a delay and they were in orbit for a while. And he actually climbed into a bag, a Velcro bag that's meant to be used for a camera. And it's hard to see in this picture, but you can kind of see the camera pointing up to sort of that navy colored plastic bag. That's got Velcro around it, and he pulled that down and tightened it around his shoulders so that he could look out of the window. And I said he pulled it down. He pulled it out. There's no up or down. He was in space. But he said, I spent 2 orbits Velcroed into a camera bag up against one of the overhead windows so that I was just darkened and was watching. He said much of it was looking at the Earth, but it's also looking out at the stars. You're much more aware of how many there are. It's just everywhere, but it's just dense. But it's also colorful. And this was not taken by an astronaut, but this was a good example of a shot from NASA taken by a probe that shows how you can see the different colors of different stars. So he could see Mars, he could see Betelgeuse, he mentioned a few of them, and how that was such a strong experience for him. So I began to notice a pattern that makes up sort of the flow, the narrative flow of my book. The first thing is that this awe hits people, and it's different. So I mentioned to you that if you look at the Earth from space, you kind of understand better. A private astronaut, Richard Garriott, said, "My sense of the scale of the Earth suddenly collapsed, and I had an extremely physical, visceral, strong reaction at that moment. Like, I get it. I get the Earth. I now feel like I understand it in a way that I never could have prior to that moment. And to me, it went from being unambiguously and unknowingly large to being something that was clearly a finite, small, and delicate oasis." So his understanding increased. Zach had a different perspective looking out at the stars. He said, looking out at the universe out there from my vantage point, I began to realize we don't know crap about anything. We really don't. And I like the juxtaposition of those 2 quotes. All right, so that was what I got interested. What happens when you realize you don't know crap about anything? Well, it's humility. So this image is Carl Sagan's famously requested pale blue dot. NASA didn't want to take this. NASA wants to do NASA stuff. They don't want to have these moments. But if you look in the 3rd beam of light, the one the farthest to the right, there's a little dot there. That's our planet. And it was looking back from the outer edge of the solar system, understanding at that moment just how small we are in everything else. One of the engineers that I interviewed, a woman I called Carol, who worked for an agency that sends probes like that out into space, said, you think that everybody knows everything and they're teaching you, but people don't know everything. There's so much we don't know, and I think that's what drew me. That's the draw of space, because you're really out there. You don't know anything. And I was noticing this strong sense, this strong willingness to admit how little we know. Another engineer I spoke to, I call Cody. Mostly, I chose that pseudonym because he coded computers, and it helped me remember. But he had done some work with a probe going to Mars. He said, it's just a big deal to explore Mars. It's so hard, and it's so strange. And yet it's like we haven't even walked out our front door yet. Mars is like the pebble that's on the little lip of the door frame. So I had Carl draw this picture. And the universe goes all the way out across Southern California and over the ocean. So the vastness of it is just so amazing and just terrifying with the powers involved and the sizes of things involved. And then he said in another part of my interview with him, I think it's okay not to know things. I would much rather just admit to myself that I don't know something than to try to come up with an answer or convince myself the answer is correct. I think it's better just not to know. But the thing is, when you get in that moment of awe that forces you to reckon with how little you know, it creates a vacuum. People generally go, okay, I don't know. And you can live in that moment, and it's good to live in that moment. But then curiosity hits. So if awe encourages humility, humility encourages thoughtful curiosity, which is where we can have amazing exploration. And in the book, I give a couple examples that show what humility looks like outside of space exploration, but sort of related to it. In the 1970s, a group of young men got together and recreated a Hawaiian fishing vessel. They called it the Hokulea, which means the Star of Gladness. And one of them is Nainoa Thompson, who's the young man in that picture there. And they knew that they realized that the wayfinding abilities of the ancient Polynesians had been lost through colonization, through other things that had happened. No young Hawaiian men knew how to do this anymore. But they were able to find this gentleman, Maupiolug, who was not Polynesian, he was in Micronesia, but he was on a little island that had neither been nuclear tested or colonized. And traditional wayfinding, albeit through Micronesian culture, had been passed down to him. And they asked him with humility if he would be willing to teach the Hawaiians. And he taught a group of 11 men, 6 Polynesians, I believe, 5 Hawaiians. And once they learned these old techniques for following the stars, following the currents, paying attention to signs of animal life, signs of plant life in the water, they were able to travel to Tahiti and back without any instruments at all, completely using traditional wayfinding techniques. And the hokulea is still there. And in fact, I saw a model of it when I was in Hawaii this past week. So we got a picture of the hokulea model. But this is a great story of realizing how little you know and asking for help and working with someone else to do the exploration to satisfy that curiosity. Another person who I read about in the book is Hindu Umaru Ibrahim. She's a young woman who lives in Chad. She's a member of the Mbororo tribe. And she has been using satellite photos to help understand climate change. But what she does is she prints out these enormous printouts and works with the local community in the Mbororo group to find out what people use different areas for, how climate change is making things change. She said in a TED Talk that she talks with men first, gets all the information, then talks to the women, and the women will correct what the men say. And then the men will agree, and it allows them to think about how they understand climate change, how they can predict it, and how traditional uses that are no longer going to be available can be modified so that they can continue even with climate change. But I really loved this example of these high-tech satellite photos and this traditional tribal knowledge, not with one being superior to the other, but working together in a humble way that allowed for exploration and moving forward. Finishing up, how do we use this model of what we've done in space? This is a quote from an astronaut I call Beverly I interviewed. She was very interested in how she became very focused on the climate and preserving the Earth in space, and she thought the International Space Station was a great model for international cooperation. So here's her quote: "How do we use this model of what we've done in space? We've built the most complex thing we've ever done in space. It's not like we did it in our garage, it's in space. And yet, and for the last 20 years, 15 countries have peacefully, successfully, quietly done this together. So we can do this, and this was her model, and this is the argument that she's made since she retired from being an astronaut. So, from awe to humility to exploration, and this is a photo taken by Artemis II astronauts on their return from the moon. This was done with time-lapse, but it gives a sense of possibly what Zach saw when he was in orbit around the moon. They had so much light where they were. I'm hoping that Artemis IV will have more time to take some pictures in the darkness, but you can see how impossible it is to find constellations and how that reality of all those suns could really make you feel aware of how little you know. I'll put it that way. Well, thank you very much.